The moment you realize you are alone in an open desert with no water, the situation is already more dangerous than most people understand, because dehydration is not a distant threat but an immediate physiological process that begins the second fluid intake stops. The human body is composed of roughly 60% water, and every system inside it depends on maintaining that balance within a very narrow range, so when exposure to extreme heat combines with zero intake, the loss accelerates beyond what most survival instincts are prepared for. People often imagine thirst as the primary warning sign, something uncomfortable but manageable, yet thirst is actually a delayed signal, meaning by the time it becomes intense, the body has already lost a significant percentage of its fluid. What is often misunderstood is that the desert does not kill through heat alone, but through a chain reaction where temperature, evaporation, and circulation interact in a way that quietly destabilizes the body from within. The physics of this process are simple but brutal. High ambient temperature increases sweat production, low humidity accelerates evaporation, and wind strips moisture from the skin, all of which pull water out of the body faster than it can be conserved. Field studies and military survival data show that under extreme desert conditions, a person can lose over 1 liter of water per hour through sweating alone, even without intense activity, which means the body's reserves can begin collapsing in less than a day. The survival implication is immediate and severe, because once dehydration reaches even a moderate level, cognitive function declines, decision-making becomes impaired, and the ability to assess risk deteriorates, setting up a feedback loop where bad choices accelerate physical decline. This is the point where the situation escalates from uncomfortable to life-threatening, and where survival depends not on strength, but on understanding what is happening inside the body. As hours pass, the internal balance of fluids begins to shift in ways that are not visible but critically important, because blood plasma volume starts to decrease as water is diverted to maintain essential organs and support cooling through sweat. The danger here is not just water loss, but circulation strain, since thicker blood requires more effort for the heart to pump, increasing cardiovascular load. Many assume that as long as they can still move and think, they are functioning normally, but dehydration reduces blood flow to the brain, subtly impairing judgment long before obvious symptoms appear. The hidden mechanism is that the brain prioritizes survival processes over clarity, meaning confusion and poor decisions are not random but biologically driven responses to resource scarcity. Clinical research shows that even a 2% loss of body weight in water can reduce cognitive performance, while higher levels begin to affect coordination, memory, and awareness. This creates a dangerous illusion of control, where a person believes they are acting rationally while their ability to evaluate options is already compromised. The survival implication is critical, because movement decisions made during this phase often determine the outcome, and unnecessary activity in extreme heat dramatically increases water loss. As this imbalance continues, the body's cooling system becomes less effective, forcing it into a state where internal temperature begins to rise, pushing the situation toward heat exhaustion and eventually heat stroke if conditions persist. The transition from dehydration to thermal crisis is not separate but continuous, and once it begins, the margin for recovery narrows rapidly. At a more advanced stage, the body reaches a point where it can no longer sustain both cooling and circulation effectively, and this is where one of the most misunderstood symptoms appears: the sudden reduction or complete cessation of sweating. Many interpret this as a sign of stabilization, but in reality it signals a failure of the thermoregulatory system, meaning the body has run out of the fluid necessary to produce sweat. Without evaporation, heat accumulates internally, and core temperature can rise to dangerous levels within a short time. The underlying science involves the hypothalamus, the part of the brain responsible for temperature regulation, which begins to lose control as dehydration disrupts normal signaling pathways. Clinical observations of heat stroke victims show that once sweating stops, core temperature can exceed 40 degrees Celsius, leading to protein denaturation, enzyme failure, and damage to vital organs. At this point, confusion becomes severe, behavior becomes unpredictable, and the risk of collapse increases dramatically. The survival implication is that physical endurance is no longer the limiting factor, because neurological stability and organ function take precedence over muscular strength. This stage represents a critical escalation where recovery without external intervention becomes increasingly unlikely, and every additional minute in direct heat compounds the damage. The transition here is not gradual, but accelerating, as the body moves from compensating to failing. What makes desert survival particularly dangerous is not just the environment itself, but the misconceptions people bring into it, especially the instinct to keep moving in search of help. Movement in extreme heat is one of the fastest ways to increase dehydration because it raises metabolic demand and increases sweat rate, effectively multiplying water loss. The overlooked principle is that survival in such conditions is governed by conservation, not distance covered, meaning the goal is to reduce water loss rather than maximize movement. Research into survival cases consistently shows that individuals who limit activity during peak heat and seek or create shade have significantly higher chances of survival compared to those who continue moving. The physics behind this is straightforward. Reducing exposure to direct solar radiation lowers radiant heat gain, while minimizing physical exertion decreases metabolic heat production, both of which slow the rate of dehydration. The survival implication is that patience becomes a primary survival strategy, and resisting the urge to act impulsively can extend survival time by several hours or even days depending on conditions. However, as dehydration worsens, the ability to make this decision declines, creating a paradox where the correct action becomes harder to choose precisely when it is most needed. This leads to further escalation, as poor decisions compound physiological stress, pushing the body closer to irreversible failure. As the process continues, electrolyte imbalance begins to play a significant role, because water loss is accompanied by the loss of sodium, potassium, and other essential ions that regulate nerve and muscle function. The danger here extends beyond dehydration itself, as imbalances can lead to muscle weakness, cramps, and disruptions in heart rhythm. Many assume that water alone is the only concern, but the body's internal chemistry depends on maintaining precise concentrations of these elements, and their loss affects everything from movement to cognition. Scientific evidence from dehydration studies shows that electrolyte imbalance can exacerbate fatigue and confusion, further reducing the ability to respond effectively to the environment. The survival implication is that even if water is eventually found, recovery is not immediate, because the body must restore both fluid and chemical balance before normal function returns. This adds another layer of complexity to survival, as the window for effective intervention becomes narrower with time. As this imbalance progresses, the body's systems begin to shut down in sequence, starting with reduced urine production, followed by declining blood pressure, and eventually multi-organ stress. The escalation here is systemic, affecting not one function but the entire organism, and the transition toward collapse becomes increasingly difficult to reverse. In the final stage, the combined effects of dehydration, extreme heat, and electrolyte imbalance converge into a critical condition where the body can no longer maintain homeostasis. The brain becomes severely impaired, leading to disorientation, loss of coordination, and eventually unconsciousness, while the cardiovascular system struggles to maintain circulation under reduced volume. This is not a sudden event, but the result of cumulative stress reaching a tipping point, where compensatory mechanisms fail simultaneously. Evidence from emergency medicine shows that survival at this stage depends almost entirely on rapid cooling and rehydration, interventions that are not available in an isolated desert scenario. The implication is stark, because without external assistance, the probability of survival decreases sharply once this threshold is crossed. The process that began with mild thirst ends in systemic failure, driven by a cascade of predictable and well-documented physiological responses. The final transition is not dramatic, but inevitable, as the body exhausts its capacity to adapt, leaving survival dependent on decisions made much earlier in the timeline.